One might argue that if Saela Vane had ever once learned to fight for the things she wanted, the Alpha King would never have managed to divorce her so quietly. But then again, if the man had bothered to give her a single honest reason, she'd have had something worth fighting for. So really, when you laid the whole business out end to end, the catastrophe was entirely his fault. Every cold, gold-embossed, immaculately lawyered page of it, all of it. She held that thought the way she held a scalpel, carefully and by the dull end, because holding on to her anger was easier than looking across the table at him. The dissolution of a royal mating was, apparently, a very civilized thing. It was happening on the 40th floor of the Ash Tower, in a glass room that hung out over the city like a held breath, all pale wood and colder light. Saela had come straight from a double shift, and she was aware she looked it. Scrubs still on under her coat, hair scraped back, the smell of the emergency ward clinging to her when everyone else in the room smelled of money. The pack elders lined the walls the way crows line a fence. Not one of them had ever learned her name in the 3 years she'd been queen. They had only ever learned the word for what she was, which they said behind their hands, like a diagnosis, commoner. "If the terms are acceptable," said the regent, Sabin Ash, in the voice of a man reading a weather report, "we can conclude." The terms were extraordinarily generous. That was the part that had kept her up all week, turning it over like a stone, with something living underneath. A man who wanted rid of an inconvenient wife did not hand her half a fortune and a house by the water. He simply put her out. Generosity like this was a door being closed so gently that you were supposed to mistake it for kindness. She had tried, in the early days, to earn the room the honest way, by being good, by being useful, by healing the pack members. These same elders wouldn't lower themselves to touch. It hadn't moved a single one of them an inch. A commoner who was useless was a joke. A commoner who was useful was a threat. There had never been a third option on the table, and she'd spent 3 years learning there never would be. So somewhere in the 2nd year, she had stopped performing for them entirely. And the strange thing, the thing she kept snagging on even now, was that Corvin had seemed to like her better for it. Right up until the morning he'd stopped looking at her at all, she made herself look at him. Then, at Corvin. The Alpha King sat at the head of the table exactly the way the portraits of him sat. Spine straight, jaw like something quarried, dark hair swept back without a strand out of place. He had not looked at her once. Not when she'd come in. Not when the lawyers droned through the settlement. Not now. He kept his left hand below the edge of the table, out of sight. And Saela, who had spent 10 years learning to read the small betrayals of a body in distress, noticed the way the muscle in his forearm stood out, as though that hidden hand were gripping his own knee hard enough to bruise. "Odd," said the part of her that would always infuriatingly be a doctor first. The room was cold. He was sweating at the temple. He had not touched the water in front of him, and Corvin Ash never passed up the small theater of pouring himself a glass and not drinking it while lesser men squirmed. She filed it away under grief, because grief was doing strange things to her own body too, and turned her eyes to the paper instead. Dr. Vane. The regent slid the pages toward her with one finger, as if her name were a courtesy he was doing her. "Where the tabs are marked." The pen was heavy, some lacquered thing worth more than her first car. She signed, Saela Vane, in the small cramped hand of a woman who wrote mostly prescriptions. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. Each signature was a small tearing sound, though the paper made no sound at all. That was the bond, she knew. The mate bond didn't break clean. It frayed thread by thread, and every page she signed pulled another one loose somewhere behind her ribs, so that by the last tab she was signing through a pain she refused to let reach her face. Then it was his turn. They passed him the pages. And the Alpha King of the Ash Dominion, a man she had watched stare down rival packs and hostile boards, and one memorable assassination threat without so much as blinking, picked up the pen, and his hand shook. It was the smallest thing. A tremor, there, and gone, so slight that the lawyers didn't catch it. But the nib skipped on the downstroke of his name and left a thin scar of ink across the page, and Selah saw his jaw tighten with something that was not grief and was not anger. It looked for half a second like a man bracing against a wave. He signed anyway. Of course he did. It is done, Sabin announced, and the elders exhaled. And somewhere, a clock that had been holding its breath began once more to tick. Dawn. Selah sat very still and waited to feel free. That was the thing everyone promised, that when the bond finally went quiet, you stopped feeling the person on the other end of it, and the silence was supposed to be a mercy. She waited for the mercy. What she got instead was a hollow where a warmth had lived for 3 years, and the sudden absurd urge to reach across the table and check his pulse. Dr. Vane will be escorted out, the regent was saying. The car is, I know where the elevator is. She stood. Her voice came out steadier than she'd earned. She gathered her coat and her ruin, and what was left of her dignity, and she made herself walk toward the door without looking back, because she was going to fall apart, and she would rather do it in a moving elevator than in front of every crow in the Dominion. She had her hand on the glass door when she heard it. A sound from the far end of the table, low, wet, tearing, the sound of a man trying and failing to breathe around something. She had heard that exact sound 100 times in the ward, and it had never once meant anything good. Selah turned. The Alpha King was on his feet, one hand flat on the table, the other pressed to his mouth. And when he took it away, so his people could see what she could already smell across the whole length of the room, there was blood between his fingers. The next 4 minutes did not belong to the queen he had divorced. They belonged to the doctor, and the doctor did not need anyone's permission. Selah was across the room before the first elder had finished gasping. Down, get him down, on his side, now, and her hands were on him, the man who hadn't let her touch him in months, easing 200 pounds of collapsing Alpha to the floor so his own weight didn't drown him. Blood, not much of it, but wrong-colored, dark as old wine. His pupils were blown wide. His skin under her fingers was cold and damp and utterly terribly familiar, and she catalogued all of it in the flat back room of her mind even as the front of it was screaming. He needs a hospital, not a boardroom. She snapped at the ring of useless faces above her. Somebody call ahead to Ironhold Memorial and tell them, Code Silver, tell them poisoning, tell them, you will step back. The regent's hand closed on her shoulder and his voice had lost its weather report calm. You are not his physician. You are not his wife. You signed. You have no standing here, Dr. Vane. None. And you will let his own people, were standing right here while he bled. But it didn't matter what she said. It never had. 2 of the pack's enforcers peeled her off him with the gentle, immovable strength of men who did this for a living, and she was walking backward toward the elevator, whether her feet agreed or not, watching a cluster of strangers in good suits carry her husband, her ex-husband. The word was a splinter, out through the far doors on a folded coat. Doing 3 things wrong, for everyone they did right. By the time she reached Ironhold Memorial, they'd had an hour's head start, and she had nothing at all. This was her hospital. She had trained in it, bled in it, slept in its on-call rooms, until she'd forgotten what her own bed felt like. And tonight she stood in its lobby in her own scrubs, and was told, by a security guard who apologized the entire time, that Dr. Vane was not on the approved list for the 6th floor, and would she please wait. The 6th floor was where they put people who mattered. She had worked it for 2 years. She knew the badge readers, the blind corner by the linen store, the fire door that had latched wrong since the spring, and that maintenance kept forgetting to fix. She was, she reflected, being escorted out of buildings a great deal today. So she waited, and she was good and small and quiet about it, until the guard was called away to deal with a family arriving in tears. And then Selah Vane, who had never in her life broken a rule she couldn't justify, walked calmly to the stairwell she wasn't allowed to use, and went up. The sixth floor smelled of antiseptic, and, underneath it, of him. 3 years of marriage had taught her his scent the way she knew her own hands, and even scrubbed and sick, and half a corridor away it reached into some animal part of her and pulled. She'd assumed the severed bond would have taken that too. It hadn't. Her body still turned toward him like a plant toward a window, and she hated it, and she followed it anyway. She kept to the wall. She knew this corridor. She knew the door. It stood at the end, half open, a wedge of hard white light spilling across the floor, and through the gap, she could see the foot of a bed, a bank of monitors, and a clipboard hooked over the rail, where the night nurse had left it, because the great ones upstream never read their own charts. Selah slid through the gap and picked it up the way she'd picked up 10,000 charts, out of pure animal habit, and she began to read, and the floor of the world quietly opened beneath her, because this was not tonight's story. The blood work went back months, liver panels that should have belonged to a dying man twice his age. A creeping patient collapse. She recognized on sight because she'd written papers on it. Chronic exposure, low dose. The kind of thing you built up in a body so slowly that by the time it showed its hand, it had already won. Silver root, or something refined out of it. A poison administered a little at a time by someone with steady access and infinite patience. She read it a second time, hunting for the mistake that would let her set the clipboard down and go home. Doctors made errors, labs mislabeled. There were 100 innocent reasons a panel could look like this. She checked each one and crossed it off, the way she'd been trained, and every crossing off shut another door, until there was nothing left but the ugly little room at the end of the hall with the truth sitting quietly inside it. He had not gotten sick tonight. He had been dying since before the spring. She flipped past the panels to the medication log, and here the cold crept higher up her arms. Someone had been careful. The doses of his supposed heart tonic were logged in a neat, clinical hand, initialed each time, regular as a tide, and on 3 separate nights the initials had been scored out and written over, as though a different person had signed for the dose and then thought better of leaving a name. She pressed her thumb to one of the blotted entries. Beneath the ink, faint as a scar, she could just make out the ghost of 2 letters before they'd been ruined, not enough to name anyone. Enough to know that someone on this ward had wanted very badly not to be remembered standing over his bed with a syringe. She stood there with the clipboard shaking in her hand, and did the arithmetic she did not want to do. The first abnormal panel was dated in March. He had filed for the divorce in April. He had begun quietly signing away half of everything he owned, and her in the exact same weeks that a doctor's eye would have told him he was a dead man walking. He didn't throw me away, she thought, and the thought was so enormous she had to grip the bed rail. He was getting me out of the blast radius. You always did read other people's mail. His voice was a wreck of itself, barely a scrape of sound, but she'd have known it anywhere. Selah's head snapped up. Corvin's eyes were open, pale, exhausted, fixed on her with an expression she had never once seen him wear in 3 years of marriage. Not the cold mask, not the king. Fear, and it was fear for her, Selah. He wet his cracked lips, and every word plainly cost him something he didn't have to spare. You have to get out of this building, right now, before he knows you were ever. The door behind her clicked shut. She turned, expecting the regent, expecting enforcers, expecting to be marched back out into her nice, generous exile. But it was only a nurse, she half knew, wide-eyed at finding a barred doctor at the Alpha's bedside, and after a frozen second, the girl mouthed 5 minutes and slipped back out to stand watch. Even here it seemed, Selah still had 1 or 2 people who owed her more loyalty than the crown did. She turned back to the bed. Who's he? Corvin? Go home. I signed away the right to be told to go anywhere by you. She set the clipboard down with a crack and pulled the pen light from her breast pocket, because if he wanted her gone he was going to have to survive long enough to make her. Follow the light. Don't argue just there. Good. His pupils were sluggish, uneven. Her stomach turned over. How long have you known you were being poisoned? Something flickered across his ruined face. He'd expected her to gasp, she realized. To weep, or rail, or throw the ugly word poison at him like an accusation. He had not expected her to simply pick up the thread and start working, the way she'd have worked on any stranger bleeding out on her table. For just a moment the king went somewhere far away behind his own eyes, and what was left looked painfully, unbearably young. Roughly since March, he admitted. I didn't know what. I knew I was dying. I knew it was being done to me. A breath that rattled. And I knew that the moment I started hunting, the how and the who, whoever's holding the spoon, would look at everything I loved and decide what to take first to keep me obedient. So I made sure there was nothing left of mine for them to take. His pale eyes found hers and held on, steadier than the rest of him. I gave you away, Selah, so that no one would ever think it was worth their while to use you against me. It was the only clean thing I've done in a year. The worst of it, the genuinely unforgivable part, was that it was a good reason. She had come up here, braced to hate him, had nursed the hate the whole drive over, like the only warm thing in a cold car, and he'd gone and given her a reason that was almost noble, and she hated that far more than she'd ever managed to hate him. It was a stupid reason, she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. You could have told me. I detect toxins for a living. I could have saved you. She bit the words clean in half before they could reach the air. Telling you, he said gently, was the one thing guaranteed to get you killed. Think it through, doctor. You'd have started asking questions inside a week. You'd have pulled my charts, exactly like you just did, and you'd have found exactly what you just found, and then you'd have marched into a room full of the most dangerous people in the Dominion and announced it, because you have never, in your life, managed to sit on a truth that might save someone. His mouth pulled sideways, not quite a smile. I know you, Selah. I married you for it. I couldn't very well keep you and expect you to stay quiet, so I did the only sum that came out with you alive at the end of it. She wanted to tell him the sum was wrong. She couldn't. Quite, because she was already standing in his room with his stolen chart, proving his point for him. You cut the bond too, she said, and hated how small it came out. 3 years, and this was the wound that surfaced. Not the poison, not the lie, but the silence where he used to be. You didn't have to do that part. I did. His eyes closed a moment. If they'd ever put a blade to you, I didn't want to be able to feel it. I'm not strong enough for that. I'd have burned the whole Dominion down to reach you, and given them everything they wanted in the doing of it. He said it plainly, like a man reporting the weather, and that was somehow worse than if he'd wept. She turned it over, a man so frightened of what he might do to save her, that he'd cut the cord sooner than trust himself with it. It was the most backhanded declaration of love she had ever been handed, and it landed harder than any bouquet ever had. Voices out in the corridor. The nurse's, high and apologetic. Under it, a deeper one, unhurried, certain. The regent, come to collect his nephew, and no doubt to have the barred ex-queen removed from the building for the second time in one night. Corvin's hand shot out and caught her wrist. Even now, even wrecked, his grip was warm and sure. Whatever you think you've worked out, he breathed, you tell no one, not the nurse, not the enforcers, not a soul. If they learn, you know, you become useful. And useful is the most dangerous thing a person can be to me right now. Please. For once in your life, walk away. Selah looked down at the hand around her wrist, and then at the chart, and then at the man, at the failing liver panels, and the steady March date, and the 3 years of a cold mask she'd finally understood the shape of. She thought about walking away. She was, after all, very good at being told to leave. Instead, she turned her wrist inside his grip until she was holding him, 2 fingers pressed to the thready gallop of his pulse, and she made him a different promise than the one he'd asked for. I'll walk out that door, she said. And I'll smile at your uncle on the way past, and I'll be a good, discarded, harmless little commoner, and no one in this building will have the first idea what I know." The door handle began to turn. She leaned down, close to his ear, close enough that the ghost of the broken bond ached like a phantom limb. "But I'm the best poison doctor in this dominion, Corvin, and somebody in your circle has spent 6 months trying to murder you slowly, so I'm not going home. I'm going hunting." His eyes widened. And as the door swung open on the regent's smiling, patient, terrible face, Selah straightened, stepped back, and understood the one thing that turned the cold in her veins to ice. Whoever had been feeding her husband poison a careful spoonful at a time for 6 long months had to be someone with standing on this floor. Someone the crown trusted without question, which meant the person who wanted him dead was almost certainly already in the room. There is no arrangement in the world more awkward than doctoring a man you used to be married to, and Selah managed to invent a worse one by doing it while pretending she was neither his doctor nor his wife. The cover story was Corvin's, and she resented how good it was. The Alpha King, it was quietly given out, suffered from a recurring blood ailment, nothing catching, nothing weakening, simply a condition that wanted managing by a discreet specialist. And who more discreet than the commoner ex-queen, a decorated toxicologist, bound to silence by the very settlement that had put her out with no love left for pack gossip and every reason to keep her mouth shut. It was airtight. It let her move a cot into the estate's medical suite and put her within 20 feet of him around the clock. And the beauty of it, the part that made her want to throw something, was that the whole dominion read it as the king being merciful to a woman who had nowhere better to be. The regent had permitted it, with a smile as thin as wet paper. "If it comforts him," Sabin had said, "to keep his old physician close. Grief makes sentimentalists of us all." And he had looked at her a beat too long, the way a man looks at a card he can't yet place in the deck. She had 2 allies inside the walls, and she guarded them like organs. The first was Kezia, the night nurse, who'd stood watch at his door and asked no questions, a broad, unbothered woman who could carry a covered tray past a checkpoint as though daring anyone to lift the cloth. The second lived at the other end of a burner phone. Emeric Vale, chief of medicine at Ironhold, the man who'd found a furious orphan doing sums on the ward floor 20 years ago, and turned her into a doctor. When she'd called him at 2 in the morning and said, "Only I need a mass spectrometer and your discretion," he'd said, "Bring me the sample," before she finished the sentence. There was exactly one person alive Selah trusted without a footnote, and it was him. She sent him 3 milliliters of the King's Heart tonic in a lipstick tube. Emeric had raised her without ever once making her feel raised. He taught her the ward's unwritten rules, which consultants to flatter, which to ignore, how to give a dying man the truth without stealing his last hour. And when the palace came courting the strange, blunt girl from the charity clinic, he was the only one who told her, "Go, but keep your own name." She had. It was the one piece of advice that had outlived the marriage. If there was a single seal in the whole dominion she'd have staked her life on unread, it was the one stamped on Ironhold's pharmacy stock, because Emeric ran that pharmacy like a man running a church. Before she'd sent the sample, she'd turned the tonic bottle over in her gloved hands for a long time. The apothecary's label was flawless in every particular: crest, lot code, prescriber's initials. And that was exactly what was wrong with it. The court physician had first written the tonic in April. The lot code etched into the glass belonged to a batch compounded in February, 2 full months before any prescription existed on paper. Someone had prepared the vehicle before there was an excuse to pour it. Whoever this was hadn't improvised. They'd waited, with a bottle already filled, for a reason to arrive. Then she went to work on the man himself, which was its own kind of poisoning. "You're doing the thing," Corvin observed from the bed. He looked marginally less like a corpse. Today she'd gotten fluids into him and cut the tonic to nothing, and a little of the old insolence had come back to sit in his eyes. "The pacing. You pace when you're building a case against someone. You did it the whole week before you proposed to me, if you recall." I recall you proposed to me, did I? I remember it as a joint effort. He watched her check the line in his arm with an attention that had nothing to do with medicine. Ask me your question, doctor. You've been circling it for an hour. Who wants you dead, Corvin? So many people. It's rather flattering. He said it lightly. And there it was again. The sidestep, smooth as oil on water. Half my counsel. A baker on Vell Street whose sister I declined to marry. Shall I have a list drawn up? I'm serious. You're always serious. It's my favorite of your problems. You used to like that about me. I still like everything about you. It's terribly inconvenient. He said it with no weight at all, which was how she knew he meant it, because Corvin Ash told the truth only when he could pass it off as a joke. You're going to make yourself a target chasing this. You know that. And you'll do it anyway, and I'll lie here and watch you do it, and there is no version of tonight where I come out of it having behaved well. When she didn't smile, he sighed, and for a moment, something honest surfaced through the charm. If I knew, Selah, with certainty, I would have already acted. You don't survive being poisoned for 6 months by moving before you're sure. I don't know. And she believed him, because he said it well, and because she wanted to, which she knew perfectly well were the two worst possible reasons to believe anyone. She stayed late that night doing what she was good at, reading. Not charts this time, but the room itself. The estate suite had been his father's before him, and Corvin lived in it like a man in a rented flat, nothing personal, nothing soft, except a heavy old writing desk against the north wall that didn't match anything and that he'd asked her, twice, not to bother dusting. The bottom drawer was locked. Locked drawers, in Selah's experience, were simply questions wearing a little brass hat. She had it open in under a minute, with a pick she was not, strictly, licensed to own. Inside there was no love letter, no gun, nothing so simple. There was a dossier, his own hand, months of it. Dates. The exact dates of every dose she'd reconstructed from his blood work, laid out before she'd ever arrived, cross-hatched against a list of who had been in the residence each of those nights. He had been hunting his own murderer the entire time he'd been letting the world believe he was too proud and too busy to bleed. He had lied. I don't know, had been a lie. Told to her face not 4 hours ago. And at the bottom of the last page, dated yesterday, underlined twice, was a single name. She never got to read it. Behind her, from the doorway, in a voice with all the warmth gone out of it, Corvin said, "Close the drawer, Selah." She did not close the drawer. You lied to me. She stood, the page in her hand, her thumb over the name. She hadn't let herself read yet, because reading it felt like a thing she couldn't take back. 6 months of I don't know, and you've had a suspect list since spring. You've had a name. I've had 40 names. He crossed the room slower than he wanted to. She could see the cost of every step, and he did not reach for the page. That one isn't a conclusion. It's a fear. There is a difference, and the difference is the only thing keeping half this household out of a cell it may not deserve. His eyes were very steady. If I say it out loud to you, it becomes real, and then you go and do something brave and stupid, and then you die. We have established this, you and I. It's practically our song. You don't get to decide what I can survive knowing. I decide very little, he said quietly. I decided to marry you. That's about the sum of the good decisions I've been allowed. Then stop protecting me and start using me. She didn't raise her voice. She'd learned long ago that the quiet ones landed harder. I am the finest forensic toxicologist you will ever get within arm's reach of, and you have me sleeping on a cot 10 feet from your bed while you try to solve your own murder with a locked drawer and a fountain pen. It's insulting. To both of us. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not agreement yet, but the front edge of it, the look of a man running low on reasons to keep saying no. All right, he said slowly, all right. When you've mixed every dose that goes into me for a week, and I know the line into my arm is clean, I'll give you the drawer, all of it, every name I've been afraid to write twice. The ghost of the old insolence flickered. We'll both be sorry I agreed to this. It was a low move, agreeing with her at last in that worn-out voice, and she was still deciding whether to soften toward him for it when she smelled it. Underneath the antiseptic, and the leather, and the warm copper scent of a sick alpha, something bitter, green, wrong. It was faint, it would have been nothing to anyone else, a sourness under the ordinary hospital smells, the kind of note a mind files away as a flower left somewhere to rot. But Selah had built a career on the difference between a smell that meant nothing and a smell that meant a family was about to lose someone, and her whole body had decided which this was before her mind caught up. It was coming from the fresh IV bag Kezia had hung 2 hours ago, the one Selah hadn't mixed herself. Her body moved before the thought finished. She tore the line out of his arm. He grunted, startled, and slammed the roller clamp shut and had the bag off its hook and across the room in the sink, all in the time it took him to say her name once. Concentrated. Not the patient trickle that had been killing him by inches for half a year. This was a killing dose, a whole season's worth in a single bag, meant to stop his heart inside the hour and be gone by morning. Someone was in this room. Her voice came out flat and strange. In the last 2 hours, someone with access to the suite and to a pharmacy, who knew Kesia's rotation, who knew exactly how much. The service door at the back of the suite clicked. She was across the room in 4 strides. A figure, hooded, quick, already halfway into the dark of the linen corridor. And Selah, who had never once claimed to be a fighter, who healed for a living precisely because she'd grown up on the wrong end of other people's fists, did the one thing her body still remembered from those years. She got low and took the runner's trailing ankle, and the two of them went into the wall hard enough to bring the linen shelves down around them. For one bright second, she had a fistful of hood and the hot animal panic of a body that hadn't expected to be caught, and she hauled at it, trying to drag a face into the light. Then an elbow snapped back into her cheekbone, white light, a burst of pain, and her grip tore loose. A boot caught her under the ribs and drove the breath clean out of her, and by the time she'd blinked the corridor back into focus, they were already up and moving, fast and low, and horribly disciplined. No wasted motion anywhere in them. Gone into the belly of the estate through a servant's door that should have been locked and wasn't. Not a thief. Not a fanatic. Someone trained, and someone with a key. She was on her knees on cold tile with her face already swelling, and Corvin's voice raw with terror behind her. But her hand had closed on something in the scuffle. She opened it under the corridor light. A cap syringe, dropped in the struggle, empty now, and stamped along its barrel, small and clinical and utterly damning, was a lot number and a seal she knew as well as her own signature. Ironholt Memorial, pharmacy stock, her hospital. Nope. Emeric's hospital. The poison that was killing the Alpha King was walking out of the one building in the Dominion Selah had trusted with her life. She sat back on her heels in the cold and made herself breathe. Ironhold held 3,000 people. A seal on a barrel meant the poison had passed through that pharmacy. It did not mean the man who ran it had put it there. She said it to herself. Twice. Clearly. The way she'd say it to a panicking resident. Evidence, not conclusion. Her own courtroom mantra, and she realized with a jolt, the very principle behind the locked drawer she'd been so furious about 10 minutes ago. She understood that drawer better. Now, a name spoken too early was a loaded thing. But she also knew the arithmetic of access, and the arithmetic was ugly. Whoever had filled that syringe had drawn on Ironhold stock, known the estate's floor plan, timed it to Kesia's rotation, and moved through a locked servant's door as though they carried the key in their pocket. That was not a stranger. That was someone at home in both worlds, the hospital and the crown. There were very few people alive who lived in both, and Selah could count them on one hand. She sat there, in the wreck of the linen shelves, and did not let herself look at a single finger. They didn't speak for a while after Kesia had gone. Sworn to say nothing, sent off to strip the suite of every sealed supply they hadn't watched with their own eyes. And after Selah had let Corvin clean the split skin over her cheekbone, with a cloth and a gentleness that was somehow harder to bear than the blow had been. The estate had gone. The particular silence, of very late the hour when even a palace forgets to keep up appearances. Somewhere below them, a clock counted under its breath. It was only the two of them now, and one lamp, and the sting of the antiseptic she'd used on her own face. "You threw yourself at an armed intruder," he said, "over a bag of fluid. I threw myself at the thing killing you." She sat on the edge of the bed, because her knees had finally stopped pretending. Occupational habit. I ran toward the emergency. It's a whole personality flaw. I have paperwork on it, Selah. He set the cloth down. In the low light, the king was nowhere to be found. There was only Corvin, exhausted and unguarded, looking at her as though she were a sum that kept coming out to more than he could afford. "You could have been killed tonight, standing between me and a coward with a needle, and the entire reason I burned everything down, the marriage, the bond, all of it, was so that I would never have to watch that happen, and here you are, bleeding on my floor, again. Then you shouldn't have made it so interesting to save you." The joke didn't land the way her jokes usually did. It hung in the small warm space between them, and turned into something else, the way things had a habit of doing, at 3 in the morning after your heart has been running for its life. "Wanting you. In case the divorce gave you the wrong idea, I signed those papers with my hand shaking so hard the lawyer thought I was afraid of losing my money. I was afraid of losing you, and I did it anyway, because a live wife who hates me was worth more than a dead one who didn't. It was the best math of my life, and I have regretted it every hour since." For 3 years she had told herself a clean, survivable story. That the palace had ground him down, that a commoner wife was a young king's mistake, and he'd finally grown into the sense to fix it. She had folded the cold months into that story. The nights he didn't come, the way he'd stopped meeting her eyes, the slow retreat of a man edging toward a door. She had built the entire architecture of getting over him on the foundation of "he stopped loving me." And now he sat here, gray and gaunt and honest, for once in his life, and kicked the foundation out from under it. "You made me think it was me," she said. Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. "All those months, I thought I'd bored you, embarrassed you. Just stop being enough. I rehearsed leaving you 100 times so that you couldn't leave me first. I know." He didn't look away from it, and she gave him the credit for that. "It was the cruelest thing I've ever done, and I'd do it again tomorrow to keep you breathing. Both of those are true. I've given up trying to make them fit." She should have said something sensible. She was a sensible woman. She had references. Instead, she reached up and laid her palm along his jaw, over the stubble, over the pulse she'd been monitoring for days, and had somehow only now let herself feel as a thing that belonged to a person she loved. "Tell me to stop," she said, "and I'll go back to my cot and we'll never speak of it." "Don't you dare," he breathed, and then neither of them was speaking at all. The kiss was nothing like the careful, courteous ruin of the boardroom. It was a door blown open. His hand fisted in her hair, and hers found the warm plane of his chest, the hammer of a heart she had personally fought to keep beating, and he made a low sound against her mouth, like a man who'd been thirsty a long time and had stopped expecting water. She'd meant to be gentle with him. He was ill, she was a doctor, and then he was kissing her the way a man kisses when the world is ending, and every clinical thought she owned went out like a snuffed candle. And that was when it happened. Through the place where they touched, his mouth on hers, her hand over his heart, something crossed that had no business crossing anymore, a thread of feeling that was not her own. His fear, his relief, his want, pouring raw and unfiltered straight into her chest, so vivid she gasped against his lips. For half a heartbeat she was inside him. The animal terror of the last 6 months, the loneliness of dying politely in front of a court that might well be the thing killing him, and beneath all of it, steady as a struck bell, a want for her so total it frightened her. It was the most naked thing she had ever felt, and it was reaching her only because their guard was finally down, because for once, She had let a dying king past every last wall she had and forgotten to be a fortress. The bond. The bond he had severed with 5 signatures and a shaking hand. It was not dead, it was reaching across the cut, like a root under a wall, blind and stubborn and trying, at the worst possible moment, to grow back. Corvin went rigid beneath her. His eyes flew open, and she saw her own dawning horror answered in them, because he'd felt it too, and he understood before she did exactly what it meant. The one tether he had cut to keep her worthless to his enemies was knitting itself back together, left open. A bond deepened, it set. And the moment anyone learned the Alpha King's heart was bound to a commoner doctor again, she would stop being a discreet inconvenience. She would become the most valuable hostage in the Dominion. Corvin's hand came up and cradled the back of her head, holding her there against him. And through the raw, new thread, she felt the exact moment he decided not to let go. Felt it arrive in him, warm and reckless and doomed. "Let it come back," he whispered into her hair, which was either the bravest thing he had ever said to her, or the most catastrophic. "I'm tired of being safe without you." Selah closed her eyes and let herself have it, just for a breath. Then the doctor in her, who never fully slept, asked the quiet question that iced the warmth right out of her. How had the intruder known which bag to poison, on the one night she hadn't mixed it with her own 2 hands? Someone had known her routine. Someone had known the 1 hour the line was hers, no longer. Which meant that somewhere in the sleeping estate, behind a servant's door that locked from only one side, they still had a pair of eyes she hadn't found. For 11 days, Sayala let herself be happy, which was a reckless thing to do in a house where someone was still trying to commit a murder. She mixed every dose that went into him with her own hands and watched it travel down the line into his arm, and slowly, day by day, the man came back from wherever the poison had been dragging him. His color returned. The tremor left his hands. He started arguing with his counsel over the phone, in a voice that made the aides on the other end sit up straight, and then hanging up and grinning at her like a boy who'd gotten away with something. The severed bond went on quietly reknitting a thread at a time, until she could feel the low, warm hum of him from across a room, and neither of them said a word about it, because naming a thing like that felt like a way to lose it. He was, it turned out, a menace as a patient. He hid the fact that his hands had steadied by palming a playing card and making it vanish, badly, just to make her laugh. He argued that cocoa had medicinal properties, should be prescribed twice daily, and could only be administered safely by the chief physician in person. One night, when the ward was dark and the estate asleep, he talked her through the whole architecture of his loneliness. The father who'd ruled by fear, the brother who died young, the throne that had landed on a 19-year-old like a sentence, and she perched on the edge of his bed and listened and understood, at last, the shape of the mask, and exactly why he'd built it. She had married a performance 3 years ago. She was only now absurdly at the tail end of everything, meeting the man underneath it. It made her furious. It made her his. It was, she knew even then, a false spring. But she was so tired of winter, and she took the 11 days with both hands, and didn't apologize for them, not even to herself. The crack came at the treaty summit. House Marrow had sent an envoy to the estate to sign a border accord, and an Alpha King, who missed his own summit, was an Alpha King the whole Dominion would assume was dying. So Corvin stood in the great hall in full ceremony, immaculate again, the mask fitted so seamlessly that only Selah could see the exhaustion behind it, because she could feel it humming down the bond, the cost of every gracious smile. She stood at the edge in a borrowed gown, playing the discreet physician, and for one warm and dangerous hour, it was almost a party. She watched him work the room and understood watching that the ease she'd resented for 3 years had never been ease at all, Every laugh was placed. Every hand he clasped, a half second before the other man reached for his, so that the reaching would never show. It was the most exhausting performance she had ever witnessed, and he gave it flawlessly while dying. And the only sign of the cost was the threat of him running tired and raw straight into her own chest. She had spent their entire marriage believing he found all of this effortless. He found it agony, and had simply refused, out of some terrible inherited pride, to let a single living soul see it, including, especially, her. Then the Marrow envoy raised a toast, and Corvin lifted the offered cup, and Sayla's whole body went cold. She didn't smell poison this time. She smelled nothing, and that was the tell. The wine had been decanted in the kitchens, where a dozen hands could reach it, and every other cup on the table carried the ordinary bouquet of a good vintage, and his, only his, had been scrubbed of scent the way you'd scrub a thing to hide what you'd dissolved in it. She crossed the floor before she decided to, took the cup from his hand under the pretext of a clumsy stumble, and let it shatter on the flagstones. "Forgive me," she said to a hall full of staring nobles. "My nerves," and she dropped to gather the pieces so no one would see her face. Corvin covered it flawlessly. A laugh, a joke about his skittish doctor, the summit rolling on. But under the table his hand found her wrist and held on, and down the bond came the one thing his face would never show, not fear for himself, fury. Cold, total, patient fury that they would try for him here, at his own table, in front of the one woman he'd bankrupted his own heart to protect. "Kitchens," she murmured, under the cover of gathering the glass. Someone reached the decanter in the kitchens. That's a dozen fresh hands with access, and every one of them cleared by your own household. "Then my household has a hole in it," he said pleasantly, still smiling for the room. "And you and I are going to find it." And she felt the promise of it move through him down the bond, like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Later, when the hall stood empty but for the two of them and the smell of spilled wine, he crossed to the old writing desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and set the dossier on the blotter between them. "You've earned it," he said quietly. "You've mixed my medicine for 11 days, and I'm still breathing, which is the longest that's been true in a year. No more locked drawers between us." He looked older than he had at the summit. "All the performance gone. Read the last page." It's what I couldn't say. He didn't sit with her while she read. He crossed to the tall window and stood with his back to her, the way a man stands when he's handed someone a loaded thing and can't bear to watch their face while they discover what's inside it. "Whatever it says," he told the glass, "it isn't a verdict. It's the worst fear of a frightened man, written down so it would stop rattling around in the dark where he couldn't see the shape of it. I need you to hold it that way. Evidence, not conclusion. That's your phrase. You drum it into your residents. I've had it pinned to the inside of my skull for weeks, trying to be worthy of it." Sayla sat. She turned past the dates, past the lists of who'd slept under this roof on which poisoned night, to the final page in his careful hand, and the name written there, circled twice, pressed so hard the pen had nearly gone through the paper, was the name of the man who'd found her doing sums on a ward floor and made her a doctor. The one seal in the Dominion she'd have staked her life on, unread Emmerich Vale. "No," Sayla said to the page, because the page was easier to argue with than the man. "Sayla, no. This is," she was on her feet without deciding to be the dossier shaking in her hand. "You wrote down Emmerich Vale. You think the man who raised me has been poisoning you. Do you know how insane that is? He's the reason I'm a doctor at all. He's the reason I survived long enough to marry you. He signs off on half the charity clinics in the lower city out of his own salary. He is the single most decent person I have ever—" "He runs the pharmacy the poison came out of," Corvin said, and he said it gently, which was worse than if he'd shouted. He compounded a heart tonic in February for a prescription that didn't exist until April. He has the toxicological knowledge to refine Silverroot to a dose no one else in this dominion could manage. He has standing at Ironhold and standing at court, and he has had, this entire time, the one asset no other suspect could dream of. His pale eyes stayed on her, steady and terrible. He has you, your trust, your loyalty, your eyes and your hands inside my house. Stop. Her voice came out cracked. Stop building the case. I can hear you building it, brick on brick, the way you build everything, and it's airtight, and that is exactly why I don't trust it. You can make anything sound airtight, Corvin. You made a divorce sound like mercy. You made abandoning me sound like the most loving thing a man ever did, because it was the only loving thing I had left. The room tilted. What are you saying? I'm saying I knew. The confession came out of him low and even. A man reading his own sentence. I've suspected Emmerich since the spring. And when you turned up at my hospital bed, when you forced your way in and swore you'd hunt whoever was killing me, I let you stay. Because as long as you loved him, he'd never believe I was closing in. His own protégé at my bedside, trusting him completely, meant he'd feel safe, meant he'd get careless. His jaw worked. I used the one clean thing in my life. I let you go on loving the man I believe is murdering me, because your blindness kept me alive. Tell me that isn't the ugliest thing you've ever heard. She thought of the 11 days, every dose she'd mixed with her own hands, feeling useful, feeling chosen, and how neatly that usefulness had folded itself into serving him. She thought of how safe she had felt, safer than in years, and of how precisely a clever man weaponizes the exact thing that makes you feel safe. She wanted to. She stood with the dossier crushed in her fist and wanted, more than she'd ever wanted anything, to tell him he was wrong. Tell me I'm wrong, she whispered instead. About Emmerich, say it's a coincidence. The batch, the seal, all of it. Say you have it wrong, and I'll believe you. Corvin looked at her for a long moment, and he did not say it. He'd never once lied to her when it counted, and he wasn't going to start now, even to keep her, and the fact that his honesty was breaking her heart was, she understood dimly, the whole tragedy of him. So the marriage got repaired, she said, because it was useful to you. That's not don't. She stepped back. The bond, letting it come back, was that strategy too? Keep the doctor close. Keep her heart on a string? Keep her useful? Her voice cracked straight through. How much of the last 11 days was real, Corvin, and how much was you managing your asset? All of it was real. He came around the desk and she retreated, and he stopped at once, the way he always did, and that small mercy nearly undid her, every second. That's the part you're not going to believe, because you've decided the only reason a man could keep you close is that you're useful to him. Something shifted in his face, careful, now reaching for a wound she hadn't shown him. Who taught you that, Selah? That certainty. That you don't belong up here. That you're only ever tolerated. That love has to have a use before anyone would spend it on you. You've carried it as long as I've known you. Where did you learn it? The question went into her like a splinter, because she didn't have an answer ready, and she always had an answer ready. She'd carried the certainty so long, she'd stopped seeing it as a thing that had come from somewhere. It had simply always been true, the way the sky was true, that people like her were tools to people like him, that affection was a currency she'd be a fool to trust, that the smart thing, the safe thing. Someone had taught her that. She could almost hear the voice it had been taught in, low and kind and endlessly patient. And she flinched away from hearing it clearly, because if she heard it clearly, she would have to know whose it was. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She took the dossier with her. Some cold professional corner of her refused to leave evidence lying on a desk, even now, and she walked out into the corridor, and she did the only thing that made any sense at all in a world that had just come apart. She went to find the one man who had never once, in 20 years, let her down. Behind her, Corvin didn't call her name, That was the thing that nearly stopped her in the doorway. That he let her go without a single word, when a word was the one currency he had never in his life run short of. He had, finally, 6 months, and 1 marriage too late, learned how to stop performing at her. She kept walking anyway, because a lesson learned too late is only another kind of wound. He was the one fixed point left standing after everything else had fallen over. She needed him to look her in the eye and tell her the king was a liar. She needed it so badly that she never once stopped to ask why she needed it, or who, exactly, had trained her to run in the worst moment of her life. Straight to him. She went to find Emeric. He was in his office at Ironhold at that late hour, because of course he was. Emeric Vale had never in his life left a building while there was work in it. He took one look at her ruined face and was around the desk in a heartbeat, and when his arms came around her, she nearly wept with the relief of being held by someone who had never wanted anything from her but her success. "He's accused you," she said into his shoulder, Corvin. "He thinks you've been poisoning him. He has a whole file, Emeric. The batch numbers, the seal." She felt him go still. It was almost nothing at all. A held breath half a second too long, the stillness of a man deciding which face to put on. She'd have missed it a fortnight ago. But she'd spent that fortnight learning to read the tells of people who were lying to her, and she felt this one land in her stomach like a swallowed stone. He drew back, and his kind face arranged itself into sorrow. "Oh, Selah. I hoped to spare you this. Sit down, there's something you have to understand about the man you married." And he told her that Corvin Ash had staged his own poisoning, a slow, survivable dose, self-administered, to justify a purge of the houses that opposed him, Marrow chief among them, and Vale with them. That the accord signed tonight was a death warrant for the lower districts, sold to Marrow for gold, that Corvin meant to name Emeric the poisoner and hang him to frighten the rest. "He needs it to come from someone the council can't dismiss," Emeric said, taking her hands. "So I need you, child. Tell the Marrow envoy what he's done. Your word, the king's own doctor, his wronged wife, no one in that room will doubt it. We can stop him tonight. We can save our people." And Selah nodded, and let her face crumple, and thought, he's lying, because the timeline was wrong. Emeric said Corvin had dosed himself to justify a purge, but the first poison panel was March. And there was no Marrow accord in March, no purge to justify, nothing to gain. There had been nothing at all except a young king quietly beginning to die. The lie had a seam in it, and once she saw the seam, she saw the whole garment. And then he said the other thing, the thing that finished it. "You know how they are up there," Emeric murmured, stroking her hair the way he had when she was 13, and furious. "Our kind are never anything to them but useful. You were a novelty to that boy, Selah, a pretty tool. It's what I always feared for you, that you'd forget where you came from and let them make you believe you belonged." She heard it then. Her own oldest wound, the one Corvin had asked about. "Who taught you that you don't belong?" And here it was, in Emeric's gentle voice, being pressed into her like a thumb into a bruise, the way it had been pressed 1,000 quiet times across 20 years. He hadn't just poisoned a king, he'd been poisoning her one careful drop of doubt at a time, keeping her small and grateful and his, so she'd never look up long enough to see him clearly. 20 years. Every time the palace had bruised her, he had been there to press on the bruise and call it comfort. "Our kind, a pretty tool, where you came from." He'd built the cage so gently that she'd mistaken its bars for the only walls that had ever kept her safe. Corvin had asked who taught you, and here was the answer, stroking her hair in the lamplight. The same hands that had taught her to hold a scalpel had spent 2 decades teaching her to hold herself cheap. "You're right," she said, and smiled and wiped her eyes. "Of course, what do we do?" The council chamber still held them all when Emeric led her in. The Marrow envoy, the Grey Regent Sabin, she'd wasted the better part of a fortnight suspecting, and Corvin at the head of the table, who looked up at her entrance and let his whole ruined heart show in his face for one unguarded second before he saw whose arm she was on. And the light in him went out. Your Excellency, Emmerich said to the envoy, grave and certain, it grieves me. But the king's own physician has seen what he's done. Selah, tell them. Every face turned to her. She felt the whole weight of the room settle onto her shoulders at once, the envoy leaning in, hungry for the scandal that would sweeten his border terms. The regent's grey stare, giving nothing away, and Corvin watching her with the careful, ruined blankness of a man who had decided he would not beg for his life in front of his enemies. She let them all wait one heartbeat, longer than was comfortable. Then she chose. I'll tell you exactly what I've seen, Selah said, and turned to the envoy and set the dossier and a sealed syringe on the table between them. This poison was refined, from silver root, to a purity only 3 people in this dominion could achieve. It came out of Ironhold's pharmacy on stock that only its chief may sign for. And the vehicle was compounded in February, for a prescription, written in April, prepared in other words, before there was any reason on earth to give it, by a man who has been feeding it to King Corvin, a spoonful at a time since before the first snowmelt. She lifted her chin. I would stake my life on that pharmacy's seal. I nearly did. Search Dr. Vale's private compounding room and his ledgers, and tell me whether you find the medicine of an innocent man. The chamber went silent as a held breath. She's distraught, Emmerich said, and his voice had changed. The warmth gone, something cornered underneath. Grief. He's turned her against. Then a search costs you nothing, said the regent quietly, and nodded to the guards. And the kind old face Selah had loved for 20 years simply came off, like a mask cut loose, and what was left underneath was a man who'd run out of room. The scalpel was in his hand, and he was moving at her before the guards cleared the door. But he had made one miscalculation, the same one everyone always made, which was to forget what a girl from the charity clinic had learned before she ever learned medicine. She turned inside the strike, caught the wrist she'd watched suture 10,000 wounds, and put him down across the table, with his own arm wrenched up behind him. You taught me to keep my hands steady, she said, close to his ear, over the sound of the guards coming, no matter whose blood was on them. Then they had him, and it was done, and she straightened up in a room full of people who finally believed her, and found she could not look at the one face she'd done it all for. 6 months on, the Dominion decided it had always known Corvin Ash was a great king, which was generous of it, considering how close it had come to letting him die. Emmerich Vale awaited trial in a cell beneath the old fort. The rot he'd worked into Ironhold's pharmacy for years, the quiet fortunes skimmed to fund a rival house, the careful cultivation of a protégé he'd meant to use and discard, was cut out root and branch, and Selah was the one they asked to do the cutting. Because there was no one left the crown trusted more with poison than the woman who'd caught it. They made her chief of medicine. She was good at it. She had always known she would be. The trial itself would take months. Emmerich had powerful friends who had all suddenly discovered they'd never really known him. But the pharmacy ledgers didn't have friends, and the February batch didn't have an alibi, and slowly, thoroughly, the way she did everything, Selah took his empire of quiet damage apart and built something cleaner in the hole it left. The lower city clinics he'd funded to buy loyalty, she funded properly. Out of a crown budget, she bullied Corvin into signing without once having to be in the same room as him. If Emmerich had built a cage and called it care, she would build the care and burn the cage. The household man he'd bought, the trained hand with the copied key, who had hung a poisoned bag and put a boot in her ribs on the old physician's coin, turned up named in those same ledgers, and was in a cell, 2 doors from his master, before the month was out. The king had done all of that, and the king had spent all 6 of those months trying to win her back. He was careful about it, which was the cruelest part, because careful was the one thing she'd never known him to be. No summons. No commands. He never once used the fact that he was the most powerful wolf in the realm, and she now answered, technically, to his crown. The flowers came first, An absurd delivery that filled the whole chief's office and made her staff grin like idiots. And she sent them to the children's ward and thought that would be the end of it. It was not. He wrote to her instead. 2 and 3 letters a week, in his own hand, on the Crown's paper. Some were long, some were 3 lines. Some weren't about her at all. A policy he wanted her honest read on, a joke about a councilman, as though her plain opinion were still worth something to a king. I keep starting these with an apology, and running out of the word before I run out of the feeling, one said. So I'll simply keep sending them, and you can keep not answering. And we'll both know. Another. You asked me how much of the 11 days was real. All of it. I've never once managed to perform the thing I feel for you. I tried, and failed, which is exactly why I signed the papers. Ask anyone who's watched me fail at it. And one, near the bottom of a long page, she'd sworn she wouldn't finish. I don't want you back because you're the finest doctor in the Dominion, though you are. I want you back because none of the rest of it means anything in a room you're not in. And once, only once, a short one that undid her worse than all the long ones, I've started delegating. You'll be furious to hear the Dominion runs perfectly well without me hovering over every inch of it. Turns out the only thing that falls apart when I stop managing it personally is me. Come see. Don't come see. Either way, I wanted you to know I finally listened. Kezia had opinions. So did Oren. The young packmate who'd been slipping Selah past checkpoints since the first week and now guarded her office door like it was the treasury. 41 letters, Oren reported one evening, apparently having counted. The man runs a Dominion and finds time to write you 41 letters. Then he should delegate better, Selah said, and did not look up from her charts. Early on, they'd been on her side without qualification. Make him grovel, Kezia had said, cheerfully vengeful. In the first raw weeks, you don't owe that man a single thing but the bill. But somewhere around the 4th month, the wind changed. Kezia stopped counting the letters as evidence against him and started. Selah suspected, quietly rooting for him. Oren defected outright. He gave the clinics back, he said one night, as though that settled everything. Signs whatever you put in front of him, asks for nothing. My gran says, a man who stopped asking for things is the only kind worth marrying. Your gran hasn't met him? Selah said. My gran, said Oren, has met 41 letters. But the bond, which she kept shut with a discipline that cost her more each week, would not do the decent thing and wither. A closed bond was supposed to fade. Hers only ached steady and patient, a warm thread under her ribs that pulled north toward wherever he was, no matter how she starved it. Some nights, coming off a late shift, she would stand at the window of the chief's office that looked toward the estate and let herself feel the pull for exactly 1 minute by the clock, the way an addict allows herself one cigarette and then close it off again and go home to a flat that had never once felt like a room he was in. Twice she started a reply. Both drafts stayed in her desk drawer, unfinished, because every time she tried to write, I forgive you, her hand put down something truer and more frightening instead, and she wasn't ready to send a truer thing to a man. She was still, on the hard nights, trying to survive. Then, in the 6th month, a letter came that was different. Selah, it read, and only her name. No crown paper this time. You've made yourself clear, and I've made myself ridiculous, and I can't keep doing the second thing without your permission to hope, so I'll stop. No more letters, no more flowers in your waiting room. You saved my life and I repaid you by using it badly. And the least I owe you now is quiet. Be well, be happy. You'll be the best chief that hospital has ever had. See, she read it twice. It was exactly what she'd been asking for since spring. She waited to feel relieved. She had waited to feel relieved once before, at a glass table 40 floors up, with a lacquered pen in her hand and a bond fraying behind her ribs, and it hadn't come then, either. She was apparently a woman who got everything she asked for, and almost none of the things she wanted. and had somehow reached the age of 31 without noticing they were two different lists. She sat alone in her office long after the ward had gone dark, holding the one page in the whole stack that finally gave her what she wanted, and could not for the life of her understand why it felt so much like losing. That was the unbearable thing. No letters came. When their paths crossed at the war table or a hospital board, he was warm and correct and never lingered, and every time he said Chief Vane, in that even courteous voice, she wanted to throw something at his head. The trouble was that she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, and it fit her like a coat cut for someone else. The letters had been an irritation she could feel righteous about. Their absence was just quiet, a clean, well-run, entirely unbearable quiet, in which she had all the room in the world to notice how much of every day she'd spent, without ever admitting it, waiting for the next envelope to arrive. Then, on an ordinary gray morning, 9 days into the silence, Oren put his head around her door, looking like a man delivering very bad news. He privately found, "Wonderful. There's a patient asking for you on the 6th floor," he said. "Refuses anyone else. Discharged his own security. Won't give a name." Oren's mouth twitched. "Says you'll know the door?" She knew the door. It was the same room. The same wedge of hard, white light across the same floor where, half a year and an entire life ago, she'd read a stolen chart and understood that the man who'd thrown her away had been trying to save her. She stood outside it with her heart going like a hunted thing, because she understood exactly what he'd done. The most powerful man in the Dominion had checked himself, alone and unguarded, into a bed on a ward that answered to her. In Chapter 1 of them, she'd been the one barred from his side, escorted out of buildings, powerless at the wrong end of every signature. He had spent 6 months and 41 letters engineering the exact reverse. All the power in the room, for once, was hers. That was the message. That was the whole apology, made in the only language a king had left. She thought about the first time she'd stood outside this door, barred from it, a discarded wife who'd had to break 3 rules and climb a stairwell she wasn't allowed to use just to reach the man on the other side. She thought about how far a person could travel in half a year, from the wrong end of every locked door in the Dominion to standing at the right end of this one, her hand on the handle, the choice entirely her own. He had built her this. Out of the worst night of both their lives, he had built her a door that only she got to open. She opened the door. Corvin was sitting up in the bed in an ordinary patient's gown, no crown, no ceremony, looking healthier than she'd let herself notice, and more frightened than she'd ever seen him in a throne room. On the blanket in front of him lay a single envelope. "I'm told," he said, "that this is the correct venue for you and me to sign important papers. Corvin, these undo the last ones." His voice wasn't quite steady, and he wasn't trying to hide it anymore. The mask was simply gone, and had been, she realized, for months. Full restoration. "Except I've had them redrawn, because the old contract made you a queen consort, subordinate to the crown, and I find I can't stomach it. This one makes us equals in everything, or it makes us nothing. Your hospital stays yours. Your name stays yours, and there's a clause." He almost smiled that I signed first this time, with a perfectly steady hand, which the lawyers will tell you, took me an embarrassing number of attempts. "The lawyers wanted to argue about the equality clause," he went on, and she could hear the nerves under the lightness now, could see them in the way his thumb worried the edge of the envelope. "Precedent," they said. "No queen has ever held a title the crown couldn't revoke. I told them to go and find me a queen who'd earned one the crown couldn't survive revoking, and then we'd talk." They stopped arguing. He set the envelope down between them. "I'm not offering you my kingdom, Selah. You'd only reorganize it, and the council's frightened enough of you as it is. I'm offering you the one thing I never gave you, the first time around the truth, with nothing held back, and no door in my whole life you aren't allowed to walk through. He reached across the blanket and very deliberately opened the bond, threw it wide, held nothing back, and the whole 6 months of him came pouring through it at once, unperformed and undefended. The missing her that felt like an illness, the fear, the plain, helpless, useless love that had never once had a use and had never once stopped. I know I don't get to ask, he said. I used the truest thing in my life and I'd give the crown back to undo it. But I'm asking anyway, because I'm too selfish not to. Marry me again, Selah. This one, you don't get to give back. I've signed it. I mean it. I'm not strong enough to take it apart twice. The bravado fell away entirely, and what was left was small and honest, and hers. Say no and I'll walk out, and never trouble your ward again. Or take the pen. Selah looked at the envelope, and at the man who had made himself powerless, in a building full of her people, just to hand her the choice he'd once stolen. She thought about all the ways she'd rehearsed leaving him first. Then she crossed the room, and picked up the pen, and turned it over in her fingers while his heart hammered down the open bond, loud enough to fill the room. Ask me one more time, she said softly, when you're not wearing a hospital gown, when you can actually stand up and mean it, in front of everyone who said, I never belonged. She let herself smile for the first time in 6 months. And I'll say the thing you're dying to hear. Through the bond, she felt the precise instant hope crashed back into him like a tide. That's a yes, he breathed. You realize that's a yes. And there it was, pouring through the open bond. Not relief, not triumph, but a joy so unguarded, it was almost hard to look at directly. The joy of a man who had spent his entire life certain he'd have to earn every good thing by performing flawlessly for it, discovering that the best thing he would ever be given was going to be handed to him at last. For free. Ask me tomorrow, she said, and find out. In the end, it took him a week, because he insisted on standing up to do it, and standing up properly took his healers. Chief among them, a stubborn woman he was not allowed to overrule, rather longer to allow. He asked her again in the great hall where he'd once presided, over a summit that nearly killed him, in front of the whole council and House Marrow's envoy, and every noble who'd ever called her commoner behind a raised hand, and this time there was no cover story. Just a recovered king going down on one knee to the doctor who dragged him back from the dark. She said yes before he'd finished. The bond gave her away half a breath early, anyway, the way it always did now, and he laughed at her through it, and she stopped caring, who saw. They were married on a bright cold morning, with the lower city, packed to the rooftops, the boy king, everyone had underestimated, and the charity clinic girl who'd seen the man behind the crown before anyone else bothered to look. He cried during the vows. She'd known he would. She didn't, quite, but it was a near thing. No taking this one back, he murmured when it was done. Why would I? She said, when I'm the one holding the pen. So, here's what I want to know. At what point did you forgive Corvin? Was it the moment he confessed he'd used her and couldn't lie about it? Or only here, at the very end when he made himself powerless, just to put the choice back in her hands? Or are you like Selah, and think a man who signs a thing like that still has a great deal of proving left to do? Tell me in the comments. And if this story kept you to the end, you know what to do.